Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a case that once shook the entire United States to its core, not only because of the sheer brutality of the crimes, but also because the killer was someone no one in the community ever suspected, a young man, intelligent, once a proud Boy Scout, and later a serviceman in the U.S. Air Force. But behind that crisp uniform and innocent smile, hid a dark and violent mind. A predator in disguise, driven by disturbing urges, who came to be known as John Joseph Joubert IV. This isn't just the story of a string of murders. It's a chilling reminder of a terrifying truth, that sometimes, a killer doesn't wear a monstrous face, sometimes, they live right among us, blending in perfectly with the world. In this video, we'll uncover Joubert's entire descent into darkness, from his troubled childhood and the early warning signs that went unnoticed, to the horrific murders that horrified entire communities, the nail-biting investigation, and ultimately, the trial that ended with the electric chair. And there's one big question I want you to keep in mind throughout this video: are killers born as monsters, or does a broken childhood, trauma, and environment shape them into one? Stay with me until the end, because the deeper we go into this story, the more you'll realize, the truth is always far scarier than fiction. Part 1, Childhood and the Seeds of Violence. John Joseph Joubert IV was born on July 2, 1963, in Lawrence, Massachusetts. On the surface, his early life seemed ordinary, but beneath that facade lay the seeds of darkness that would later consume him. Joubert grew up in a broken home. His parents' marriage was unstable, filled with arguments, and when they eventually divorced, John was left to live primarily with his mother. His father became a distant figure, rarely involved in his upbringing. This absence left John craving a male role model, but instead of finding guidance, he found himself drowning in loneliness. As a boy, John was shy, withdrawn, and struggled to make friends. Teachers described him as intelligent, even gifted, but emotionally detached. Other kids sensed his oddness and often bullied him. He was the quiet boy on the playground, the one sitting alone at lunch, the one others whispered about but never invited to play. That isolation slowly morphed into anger. And that anger began to take shape in disturbing ways. By the time he was 6 or 7 years old, John had already started harboring violent fantasies. He would imagine hurting people who annoyed him, classmates, neighbors, even strangers. He never shared these thoughts with anyone. Instead, they grew inside him like a hidden fire, one he fed with every rejection and humiliation. One chilling story that later emerged from his childhood was about his obsession with power. As a young boy, John admitted he enjoyed scaring other kids, not just playful teasing, but genuinely frightening them. He once cornered a younger child and whispered, "Don't scream, or I'll hurt you." That child was terrified, but for John, the rush of control was intoxicating. As he grew older, these fantasies escalated. Around age 12, he began imagining kidnapping, tying up, and torturing victims. He didn't yet act on these urges, but the images were vivid, detailed, and repeated in his mind like a movie reel he couldn't stop watching. To him, violence was no longer just a thought, it was becoming a need. His mother, strict and controlling, unknowingly worsened the situation. She demanded discipline and obedience, often punishing John harshly for small mistakes. Instead of feeling nurtured, he felt trapped. At home he was powerless, but in his fantasies, he was the one in control. This is where the dangerous transformation began. His mind started linking power with cruelty, and control with violence. By his teenage years, John's private world was spiraling further. While other teens were daydreaming about sports or dating, John's mind was consumed with thoughts of knives, ropes, and domination. In one disturbing incident, he reportedly slashed a little girl with a razor blade, just to see her reaction. In another, he attacked a teacher with a blade. These attacks weren't fatal, but they were warnings, red flags that hinted at what was to come. Unfortunately, those around him either didn't recognize the signs, or chose to believe he was just a troubled kid acting out. What makes this stage of his life so terrifying is not just the fantasies themselves, but how invisible they were to the outside world. John still wore the mask of a quiet, intelligent boy. He still went to school, did his homework, and played the part of a normal teenager. But deep inside, the line between fantasy and reality was blurring. And once that line broke, there would be no turning back. Imagine a boy sitting quietly in his room, his textbooks open, pretending to study, but in his mind, he's tying knots, imagining the sound of a muffled scream. That was John Joubert, long before anyone knew his name would be etched in the history of American crime. Part 2, The First Murder in Maine, 1982. By the early 1980s, John Joubert had left behind the fragile world of adolescence. Outwardly, he looked like he was stepping into adulthood. He was smart, disciplined, and even involved in community activities. But inside, those violent fantasies had only grown stronger and darker. On August 22, 1982, the quiet city of Portland, Maine, would become the stage for his first murder. His victim was Ricky Stetson, an 11-year-old boy who loved running and often jogged along Baxter Boulevard in the evenings. Ricky was just a regular kid, full of life and energy, with no idea that his routine jog that night would end in horror. That evening, Ricky set out as usual. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city. Families were out walking, cars hummed along the road, and Ricky, wearing his sneakers and bright running clothes, ran freely along the boulevard. But someone was watching. Joubert had been cruising the area, his mind restless, his urges boiling over. And when he saw Ricky, something inside him clicked. Here was the chance he had been waiting for, the chance to turn his darkest fantasies into reality. He pulled his car closer, trailing Ricky at a distance. Then, in a sudden burst of predatory impulse, he attacked. Exactly how it happened remains chilling. Ricky was grabbed, overpowered by a man much stronger than him. Witnesses later recalled seeing a boy jogging and then vanishing into the night, but no one saw the violence unfold. Later, Ricky's body was discovered near the jogging path. He had been stabbed, strangled, and horrifyingly, he bore bite marks, raw evidence of Joubert's compulsion. The coroner noted how the wounds showed rage, not just intent to kill but to dominate, to control, to savor the act. One investigator at the scene reportedly whispered, "This wasn't just murder, this was something much darker." At the time, however, police didn't know who they were dealing with. They did what they could, they examined the bite marks, collected fibers, interviewed witnesses. But the case went cold quickly. There were no clear suspects, no witnesses who could describe the killer's face, and the forensic tools of the early 1980s were far less advanced than what we know today. The bite mark evidence was preserved, but without a suspect to match it to, investigators were left in frustration. In their minds, this was an isolated tragedy, perhaps a random act of violence. What they didn't know was that the killer had already tasted blood, and once that line was crossed, he would crave more. For Joubert, the murder of Ricky Stetson was not just a crime. It was a release. He later admitted that he felt a rush unlike anything he had ever experienced. The control, the fear in his victim's eyes, the silence afterward, it fed something inside him that had been starving for years. And the most terrifying part? He got away with it. There were no arrests, no leads pointing in his direction. To the world, he was just another young man living an ordinary life. But in his mind, he now knew, he could kill, and he could get away with it. That realization set him on a path of no return. Imagine Joubert that night, sitting alone in his room after the murder. His hands still trembling, his heart still racing, whispering to himself, "I finally did it." And no one knows. For the people of Portland, Ricky's death was a tragedy that haunted the community, but for Joubert, it was just the beginning. He would soon leave Maine, but his appetite for violence was only growing. The next time he acted, it would be even more brutal, and it would draw national attention. Part 3, Nebraska Murders, The Killing of Danny Joe Eberly, 1983. By the fall of 1983, John Joubert was living what, on the surface, looked like an ordinary life. Stationed at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, he was a 20-year-old airman, fit, clean-cut, the kind of young man people assumed they could trust. He wore his Air Force uniform with pride, walked across the base with the discipline of a soldier, and occasionally flashed the smile of a polite neighbor. To the community around Bellevue, Nebraska, Joubert was invisible in the best possible way. He blended in. He wasn't a troublemaker. No one would have thought of him as a threat. But inside, Joubert was waging a private war against urges that had haunted him since childhood. He had killed once before, Ricky Stetson in Maine, and though investigators there had no suspect, Joubert himself had tasted something he couldn't forget, the intoxicating mix of power and violence. For over a year, he had managed to suppress those cravings. But by September 1983, the hunger returned, stronger and more demanding than ever. And when he saw 13-year-old Danny Joe Eberly, it was as if fate had placed the boy directly in his path. On Sunday, September 18, 1983, Danny woke early for his usual paper route. He was just 13, but he carried himself with responsibility well beyond his years. Delivering newspapers wasn't just about money, it was about independence. His parents trusted him. His neighbors respected him. And Danny, with his soft brown hair and easy smile, had become a familiar figure pedaling through Bellevue's quiet streets at dawn. That morning, Danny hopped on his red bicycle, a canvas bag full of tightly rolled newspapers hanging from his shoulder. The neighborhood was still half asleep, the air was crisp, the sidewalks damp with dew. Houses stood quiet, curtains drawn, the world just beginning to wake. Somewhere nearby, though, someone else was awake, and watching. Joubert, restless from another sleepless night, had been prowling. His mind, tormented by fantasies of control and cruelty, was searching for an outlet. When his eyes landed on Danny, a boy alone, vulnerable, pedaling through empty streets, something inside him snapped. No one knows the exact moment Joubert decided to act. But what is certain is that Danny never finished that paper route. Hours later, phone calls began flooding the local newspaper office. Residents were confused. Where were their morning papers? Soon, concern turned into alarm. Danny's father went looking for him and stumbled upon a sight that froze him in his tracks. Danny's bicycle abandoned on the sidewalk, newspapers spilled across the pavement. It looked wrong, not like an accident, not like a careless child. Everything about it screamed interruption. Neighbors quickly joined the search. Some thought perhaps Danny had been hit by a car and taken to a hospital. Others feared he might have been kidnapped. The Eberly family clung to hope, but deep down, they knew something terrible had happened. Danny was not the type of boy to simply wander off. When the police arrived, they confirmed what the family already suspected: this was foul play. There was no evidence Danny had left willingly. The bike and newspapers were left too neatly, as though someone had taken him quickly, decisively. For 3 long days, Bellevue lived in terror. Parents refused to let their children leave the house alone. Volunteers combed fields, creeks, and wooded areas. Officers followed every lead, but with each passing hour, hope dwindled. Finally, on September 21st, searchers discovered Danny's body in a rural area outside town. The news spread like wildfire, breaking the community's fragile hope in an instant. The details were horrifying. Danny had been bound hand and foot with rope, his mouth sealed with tape. He had been stabbed repeatedly, deep, angry wounds that told a story of rage and sadism. And, like Ricky Stetson in Maine, his body bore bite marks. The coroner's report confirmed what investigators already sensed: this was no random attack. It was methodical. It was deliberate. And it was fueled by something far darker than robbery or impulse. One officer at the crime scene later admitted the silence that day was unbearable. As they uncovered the boy's small body, nobody spoke, until finally a detective muttered under his breath. This wasn't just killing. This was pleasure. The murder of Danny Joe Eberly shattered Bellevue. In a town where children rode their bikes freely and parents left doors unlocked, fear now took root. Parents began walking their kids to school. Curfews were tightened. Conversations in grocery stores and churches always circled back to the same chilling question: who could do something like this? The thought that a predator was living among them was unbearable. And yet, the killer, Joubert, was right there, driving the same streets, buying food at the same stores, walking in the same neighborhoods. Meanwhile, back at Offutt Air Force Base, Joubert carried on as though nothing had happened. He attended drills, performed duties, laughed at jokes with fellow airmen. But inside, he was replaying Danny's final moments like a film reel. The fear in the boy's eyes, the sound of muffled cries, the silence afterward. For Joubert, it was a memory he savored. In his twisted mind, he had confirmed what he already knew from Ricky Stetson's murder: he could kill, and no one would suspect him. That realization was intoxicating. It gave him a sense of control he had never felt in his chaotic childhood. Imagine him, late at night, staring into the mirror of his barracks bathroom, whispering to his reflection, "They'll never find me. I'm smarter than them." But he wasn't as invisible as he thought. The investigation was already circling closer, though he didn't realize it yet. Local law enforcement, recognizing the brutality of the crime, called in the FBI. Profilers studied the crime scene, noting the sadistic details: the binding, the gagging, the stabbing, the bite marks. This wasn't the work of someone losing control. This was someone who enjoyed control. Someone who needed to dominate, to humiliate, to destroy. Then came the breakthrough clue: the rope used to tie Danny. It wasn't standard rope you'd find at a hardware store. It was a specialized type, manufactured in South Korea, distributed almost exclusively through the US military. That detail narrowed the suspect pool dramatically. The FBI began to suspect they weren't just dealing with a random drifter, they might be dealing with someone in uniform. But Joubert, oblivious to the walls slowly closing in, was already hungering for more. The killing of Danny hadn't satisfied him, it had only deepened his cravings. In his mind, Danny's death proved what he'd always feared, and secretly desired, about himself, that he wasn't like other men. He was a predator. And predators hunt again. One can imagine Joubert lying awake at night, the base silent around him, staring at the ceiling and whispering, "Once is never enough." And true to those dark whispers, he would soon strike again. The next victim was even younger. The violence even more savage. And this time, his mistakes would finally begin to betray him. Part 4, The Murder of Christopher Walden, 1983. The winter of 1983 in Bellevue, Nebraska was supposed to be a season of anticipation, kids buzzing about the upcoming holidays, families decorating their homes, and the community preparing for a cheerful December. But for 12-year-old Christopher Walden, that December morning would be his last. And for investigators, it would mark the moment when the killer's mask began to slip. On the morning of December 2, 1983, Christopher left home like any other day, walking toward his middle school. He was described as a kind, soft-spoken boy who loved playing outdoors and helping his mom with chores. His parents never imagined that the walk to school, barely a mile from his house, would become the most fateful journey of his young life. Neighbors later recalled seeing a man in a gray sedan cruising slowly near the school zone, watching children with an intensity that didn't feel right. That man, of course, was John Joubert. Joubert had already murdered once, back in Maine. But this time, he was in Nebraska, far from the first crime scene, and he believed he had learned from his mistakes. In his twisted logic, he thought he could refine his methods, silence his victims more quickly, and avoid detection. As Christopher walked, Joubert spotted him, an isolated target, vulnerable, and exactly the type of boy he had fantasized about for years. Joubert pulled his car up alongside Christopher, feigning friendliness at first. "Hey, need a ride? It's cold out. You'll get to school faster." Christopher, wary, declined. But Joubert was persistent. According to his later confessions, when persuasion failed, he resorted to force. He lunged out of the car, dragged Christopher inside, and drove off before anyone could intervene. The boy struggled, begged, and pleaded. Witnesses later testified they heard faint cries near the wooded area on the outskirts of town that morning, but at the time, no one connected it to a kidnapping. In a secluded patch of forested land, Joubert dragged Christopher out of the car. Unlike his first victim, Richard Stetson, this time Joubert acted with more speed and precision. He bound Christopher's hands and gagged him, ensuring the boy could not scream. Then, he unleashed the full extent of his sadistic fantasies. Christopher was stabbed multiple times, but Joubert didn't stop there. He cut across the boy's body with the same peculiar, almost surgical pattern he had used in Maine. These weren't random strikes, they were methodical, ritualistic. Later, investigators would note that the stab wounds formed deliberate slashes across the chest and abdomen, almost like a signature. Most chilling of all, Joubert later admitted that Christopher begged for his life. At one point, the boy asked, "Why are you doing this?" Joubert coldly replied, "I can't stop." That short exchange captured the essence of Joubert's compulsion. He was not killing for money, revenge, or even pure rage. He was killing because he felt enslaved by his own violent desires. When Christopher's body finally went limp, Joubert left him discarded among the trees, his small frame hidden under brush and leaves. Then Joubert drove away, back into town, blending into society once again as though nothing had happened. When Christopher failed to come home from school, panic set in. His mother immediately called the police, and within hours, a massive search operation was underway. Flyers were distributed, volunteers combed the area, and helicopters scanned the woods. 2 days later, Christopher's body was discovered. The crime scene shocked even seasoned detectives. His throat had been slashed, his torso mutilated, and the bindings on his wrists bore distinctive marks, deep, triangular impressions, as if from a serrated rope or cord. It was clear to investigators that this was not a random act of violence. Whoever had done this had a pattern, a method, and a level of cruelty that suggested experience. The small town of Bellevue, once thought to be a safe suburban haven, was now gripped with fear. Parents walked their children to school, streets emptied earlier in the evenings, and whispers spread through neighborhoods. What kind of monster could do this? Unlike the Maine killing, this time the police had more to work with. The strange rope impressions on Christopher's wrists immediately stood out. Detectives collected the fibers, noting their unusual texture and triangular pattern. Forensic experts suggested the rope might be military-grade or specialty cord, not something commonly found in local hardware stores. That clue narrowed the field. Bellevue was near Offutt Air Force Base, and investigators began to wonder, could the killer be someone with military ties? Meanwhile, witnesses reported seeing a suspicious man and a car in the area around the time of Christopher's disappearance. A composite sketch was drawn, a young man, clean-cut, almost boyish in appearance, but with sharp, unsettling eyes. The sketch was circulated, and tips began to pour in. For Joubert, the murder of Christopher Walden felt, in his own twisted mind, like a success. Unlike Maine, he was convinced he had been more careful. He left the crime scene believing there was nothing tying him back. But what he didn't realize was that the very tools he used, the rope, the patterns of the wounds, and his growing overconfidence, were precisely the things that would betray him. As investigators dug deeper, the similarities between the Maine killing of Richard Stetson and Christopher's murder began to surface. The FBI was consulted, and profiler Robert Ressler, one of the pioneers of criminal profiling, noted that the ritualistic cutting was a psychological signature, almost like a fingerprint. Whoever killed in Maine could very well be the same person killing now in Nebraska. For the first time, law enforcement began to see the outline of a serial predator. By early 1984, the FBI and local investigators had formed a task force. They interviewed anyone who fit the sketch or had access to military cord. Slowly but surely, their net tightened, and John Joubert, the young Air Force enlistee with an impeccable outward reputation, was now on their radar. But Joubert had no idea that his time as a phantom was running out. Part 5, The Investigation, Arrest, and Trial. By late 1983, the state of Nebraska was no longer simply shaken, it was living in constant fear. 2 young boys, both innocent, both brutally murdered, had turned Omaha and Bellevue into towns of locked doors and whispered rumors. Parents clutched their children's hands tighter. The streets felt emptier, colder. The pressure on investigators was immense. The killer had to be stopped, before he struck again. The investigation took its first major step forward with the discovery of a crucial piece of evidence, a bite mark on Christopher Walden's body. Forensic dentistry was still an evolving science at the time, but it gave investigators something specific, something personal. Whoever this killer was, he had left behind his signature with his teeth. But that wasn't all. Witnesses began to emerge. One woman in Bellevue recalled seeing a suspicious man circling the neighborhood in a car around the time Christopher disappeared. Another child reported being followed by a man who matched the general description that police were starting to piece together: young, white, clean-cut, almost normal-looking. It was chilling. This wasn't a drifter. This wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in alleys. This was someone who could blend in anywhere. As investigators dug deeper, patterns began to surface. The killer clearly stalked neighborhoods, targeting boys who walked alone. He had military precision in how he subdued his victims: ropes, knots, tape. It didn't feel random. It felt planned. And then came a massive stroke of luck. A sharp-eyed civilian noticed something unusual: a man in an Air Force uniform buying rope at a local store. The rope matched the unique type of cord used in both murders. This tip was passed on to police, and suddenly, investigators had a new suspect in their sights: John Joubert IV, a 20-year-old Air Force radar technician stationed at Offutt Air Force Base. Detectives began discreetly investigating Joubert's background. What they found was unsettling. Here was a young man with no prior record, no obvious signs of trouble, at least on the surface. But his military record, his reserved nature, and his presence around the neighborhoods where the murders happened painted a very different picture. They secured a warrant to search his belongings. What they uncovered was chilling: a stash of ropes, knives, and other items that matched the description of tools used in the murders. Even more damning, forensic analysis later linked fibers from the rope to those found on the victims. And then came the smoking gun. His dental impressions matched the bite marks left on Christopher Walden. There was no more doubt. They had their man. December 1983. The knock on the door at Offutt Air Force Base marked the end of Joubert's illusion of normalcy. Investigators walked him out in handcuffs, surrounded by flashing cameras and reporters desperate to glimpse the face of Nebraska's nightmare. Witnesses later described him as calm, almost detached. Not the panicked look of a man caught in a lie, but the cold, eerie stillness of someone who knew the game was over. In the interrogation room, Joubert's walls finally cracked. Faced with mounting evidence, he confessed, not only to the murders of Richard Stetson and Christopher Walden in Nebraska, but also to the 1982 killing of 11-year-old Ricky Stetson in Maine, years before he had ever arrived in Omaha. The trial of John Joubert was a spectacle. Courtrooms were packed with grieving families, reporters, and everyday citizens who wanted to see justice delivered. The prosecution painted him as a monster, a predator who deliberately hunted children, bound them, tortured them, and killed them without remorse. They emphasized his meticulous planning, his cold methodology, his complete lack of humanity. The defense, however, took a very different approach. They argued that Joubert was not a monster, but a deeply disturbed young man suffering from sadistic compulsions beyond his control. They presented psychological evaluations that revealed his violent fantasies, his obsession with pain, and his inability to resist the urge to kill. In their eyes, he was sick, not evil. The courtroom was electric with tension. Families of the victims wept openly as evidence was presented. Jurors listened in horror as medical examiners described the wounds inflicted on the boys. And then came the confession tapes, where Joubert, in his own words, described his crimes with chilling detachment. The trial became more than just a question of guilt. Joubert had confessed. The evidence was overwhelming. The real question was, what should be done with him? The defense pleaded for mercy, arguing for life imprisonment instead of execution. They claimed he could be studied, understood, perhaps even treated. But the prosecution pushed back hard. They reminded the jury that 2 boys were dead, tortured, terrified, and stolen from their families forever. Mercy, the prosecutor thundered, is for those who show remorse. This man shows none. The jury deliberated. And in 1984, the verdict came down. John Joseph Joubert was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. The courtroom verdict had sealed his fate, death by electric chair. But between that final judgment and the moment the switch was pulled, John Joubert lived out his last decade inside the gray walls of Nebraska State Penitentiary, a caged predator awaiting the inevitable. During those years on death row, Joubert became somewhat of an enigma. Guards described him as polite, soft-spoken, even studious. He read books, wrote letters, and seemed, on the surface, like an ordinary inmate. Some even said he behaved better than many others in the block. But beneath that calm, clinical exterior lay a truth impossible to erase. This was a man who had slaughtered children in cold blood. There were petitions, of course. Anti-death penalty activists argued that the state had no right to take a life, even the life of a murderer. Psychologists debated endlessly whether Joubert was a product of a broken childhood or a man fully aware of the monstrous choices he made. But for the families of Richard Stetson and Christopher Walden, the years dragged on with one clear thought: justice would not be complete until the sentence was carried out. As the execution date drew closer, July 17, 1996, media attention exploded. Nebraska had not executed anyone in decades, and the electric chair itself carried an eerie weight of history. Reporters swarmed Lincoln, Nebraska, turning the penitentiary into the stage of a grim finale. Inside, Joubert prepared for death with a strange serenity. He declined a lavish last meal, choosing instead a simple serving of steak, hash browns, toast, and juice. He spent his final hours writing letters, one to his family, another to prison officials, letters that many would later describe as almost chillingly composed. In one of his statements, he admitted guilt without excuses, acknowledging the horror of what he had done. When asked if he had any final words before the execution, Joubert said quietly, "I'm sorry for what I've done. I deserve this." The words echoed through the chamber. At precisely 12:19 a.m., the current surged through his body. Witnesses described the smell of burning flesh, the jerking of his body against the restraints, the haunting stillness that followed. Less than 2 minutes later, doctors pronounced him dead. At the age of just 33, the life of John Joubert, Boy Scout, soldier, serial child killer, came to a violent end. But the story doesn't end there. Even after his execution, Joubert's crimes left scars that never healed. Parents across Nebraska and Maine grew more vigilant, their communities forever changed. Schools tightened safety measures. The Boy Scouts, once seen as a sanctuary of innocence, faced tough questions about how a man like Joubert could hide among them. Perhaps most haunting of all was the psychological study that followed. Experts dissected Joubert's life like a case study in human evil, a a child neglected and bullied, whose violent fantasies went unchecked, a man who blended in so well that no one suspected the storm inside him. Was this proof that monsters are made, not born? Or was Joubert a chilling reminder that sometimes evil emerges even when there are no obvious warning signs? For the families of Richard Stetson and Christopher Walden, no amount of analysis could erase the pain. Their sons' lives had been stolen in acts of unimaginable cruelty. But with Joubert's death, at least, they felt that a chapter had closed, a final page written in a story soaked in blood and grief. And yet, his name lingers in the annals of American true crime. Not as one of the most prolific killers, but as one of the most terrifying reminders that evil can wear a boyish face, a neat uniform, and a smile that hides something unspeakable. And so we end with a chilling truth: John Joubert's story isn't just about murder, it's about trust shattered, innocence stolen, and the terrifying realization that sometimes the danger we fear most doesn't lurk in the shadows, but walks among us, disguised as ordinary. So I leave you with one question: can society ever truly spot the monsters before they strike, or will we always be one step behind? Thank you for watching until the end of this video. If you found this story as haunting as I did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime. Until next time, stay safe, and always trust your instincts.